Views expressed in the following program are those of the individual authors and participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of Troy University or the Department of Defense. This is Troy TrojanVision One-on-One. Today's featured guest, Colonel John Dee Suggs, commandant of the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. Your hosts are Troy University political science professors Dr. Michael O. Slobodchikoff and Dr. G. Doug Davis.
Colonel Suggs, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. And I'm going to ask you, what is your personal background? How has it prepared you to become Commandant of WINSEC? And what does it mean to be Commandant of WINSEC?
Well, listen, thanks for inviting me. Before I begin, let me tell you that we in the Army, we're very aware of what Troy University does for our veterans, and I want to thank you personally, and I know that they want to thank you too. So before I jump off into my life, let me just tell you that we're appreciative of what you guys do. I'm from a first-generation immigrant. My mother was born in Peru, and she came to the United States when she was 16 years old. My uncle lived here, her uncle lived here at that time. And my father on the Suggs side, obviously, I think we've been here since they were a prisoner on the bottom of the Mayflower or something. But yeah, so we began with that immigrant upbringing. My mother struggled hard to learn English and to teach us English. We didn't even speak Spanish in the house. It was something I had to learn. The Army taught me just 10 years or 12 years ago. So I was aware of it, but it wasn't something that I thought made me different. I joined the Army. I loved it. I joined it at 17, 1987. I spent 10 years as an enlisted soldier. I went to OCF's Officer Candidate School. I became an officer, and then later they made me a foreign area officer. I guess that they had heard that my mother was a Hispanic, and so they thought, this will be a great round peg in the round hole, right? But they found out to their chagrin that I didn't speak Spanish, so then they had to teach me. But after that, I've been lucky. So they sent me to live in Argentina. I did a tour in Argentina. We did a tour in Bolivia, which is in the news right now. Bolivia's in the news. We did a tour in Peru, and my last work was with the U.S. Army North, working at with Mexico. It was it's a great job. It's a great job.
Perfect. Well, Colonel Suggs, again, welcome.
Thanks.
And you just talked a little bit about your experience in Latin America. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you how WINSEC is different from the School of the Americas.
Oh, that's a great question, and it's one that I really want to answer. So, the School of the Americas, I'm sure that there's a protest actually for the School of the Americas, which will be going on this weekend. SOA Watch does that, and it's important to talk about that. Because if we believe that democracy works, that our system works, then we have to look at what occurred and either acknowledge that it's working or ignore the change that occurred. So the School of the Americas, it was training-based. They were strictly training-based, and they just taught military skills to foreign military members. The difference is that American citizens brought up concerns to Congress that maybe we should focus more on human rights and building democratic values with our neighbors. And Congress listened. They disbanded the School of the Americas. They wrote a law, promulgated it, which said that we will create a new institution founded on human rights instruction and building democratic values within our neighbors in the hemisphere. And so my answer to those who are protesting is, first of all, God bless you. You know, I put on the uniform every day so that you have the right to protest, and you should protest if you feel something's not right. But if this great experiment that we called a democracy is going to work, then when change does occur, we have to acknowledge it. And I would acknowledge the change that occurred as a success for the people who were dissatisfied at the time.
Okay, good.
Excellent. Colonel Suggs, how does what goes on in Latin America affect the United States? How does Latin American security affect us?
Wow. So I mean, when we talk about Latin America, we talk about a hemisphere instead of just pieces of it, and our whole hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, and we talk about mutual defense of the hemisphere. So we're not talking about individual pieces. So it's the same as your neighborhood. right? This is our neighborhood, and we all want to be good neighbors, and we want to have good neighbors, but we have to look out for each other, you know? And so in its most base sense, that we just have a good neighborhood watch. And there are people who are coming into our neighborhood from other parts of the world who don't have the same values we do. They don't believe the same things that we do, and they're looking to cause trouble. And I believe that that security in this hemisphere is just about our shared values and how we protect those.
Excellent, yes.
We just celebrated a big event, and that was 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. How has the end of the Cold War really affected professional military education? Wow.
You know, can I step back just a little bit from that?
Absolutely.
So I think it's affected more than just, it's affected a whole lot. Actually, when I was thinking back, I actually wrote part of this into my master's thesis. When I was looking back, it seems like that as a country, and when I say country, because you know, when you talk Department of Defense or Department of State or the political parties, the whole country was focused not on who our competitors were, but how we needed to compete to win. So World War II, we obviously knew who the enemy was, and then you know, as you go through history, and then the Cold War was exactly the same. We knew who or what the threat was, and what we were trying to figure out. The argument was, how do we face the threat? Mm-hmm. It was not that we didn't recognize, that we didn't agree upon who the threat was. It was an argument about how we faced the threat. And it seems like after the Cold War, there was a little bit of uncertainty about what the threat was, and in academia as well, right? So when that happened, we stopped talking about different agreement and different ways to face the same thing. We started talking about. We started seeing divisions. Well, maybe this is the threat. No, maybe this is a threat. And how do we focus on these different things? And so it was a lot more divisive. At some point it was good. The Cold War was no one would ever say it was bad, but it created confusion, you know. And like I said, in academia and certainly in government. Mm-hmm. So and for us, because what did occur? What occurred was that we saw different threats, and those threats were non-governmental. I think we can all agree that terrorism is horrible, and it's hard to fight. And so we started looking at different ways, different doctrine to address that threat. Recently, we've recognized that the threat is, that while that threat continues, that the threat of large state actors are something that we really have to be prepared for, because that's where the real competition comes from in this world. And so professional military education shifted, but now it has shifted back. And I think that we're on the right azimuth, way ahead.
Good. Yeah. And I'd like to follow it up with looking at Latin American security. Mm-hmm. What is the strategy the U.S. has in our approach to Latin American states?
Wow. And I kind of hit on that earlier, right? Yeah. So I think that being a good neighbor is like the most important thing. And we talk about, when we talk about what is a good neighbor, well, we have the same values and beliefs that our neighbors have. We believe in democracy. We believe in human rights. And we need to espouse those things throughout the hemisphere. And when we're called out, as we talked about that earlier, we make changes. And we should call out the places in our hemisphere where we don't see that occurring. Now, those just ideological, general belief values. But in reality, there are a lot of bad actors. There are terrorist organizations operating in this hemisphere. There are drug cartels, which are basically terrorist organizations who have a product in our hemisphere. Those are the greatest threats in our hemisphere today. And the U.S. Southcom commander is certainly focused on those, as is the Northcom commander in the northern hemisphere. And they are truly, and when I said mutual defense of our hemisphere, they truly speak in those terms. So they recently held the Conference of the American Armies here last week. And during that conference, it wasn't a conference where the U.S. stood up and said, okay, this is what we need to do to make this hemisphere safer and a better place. it's nothing like that, and if you haven't been to one of those, I would encourage you to go. We play a supporting and equal role with our partners, and that's where we want to be. So that's the security of our hemisphere in the future, is that we're there to support them and they're there to support us.
Excellent. Yeah.
So today we started talking about security in Latin America and in the southern hemisphere, but all too often we forget that the world's a global place.
Yeah.
Everything is interconnected. And so how does the changing security environment in Asia or Africa or Europe affect what security in Latin America?
I've got a great story for you. So I remember, I don't remember, 2011. In 2011, I was in Lima, and I was actually taking a master's program, and I thought, man, it would be neat to learn Quechua, which is the indigenous prevalent indigenous language in Peru, and I thought it would be neat to do that. So I went to a renowned Quechua teacher there, and I said, hey, can I get into class? And he said, well, absolutely, but not right now. And I was like, well, why not? So he opened the door of his classroom, and it was full of Chinese students.
Oh, wow.
And I was taken aback. It was the first time and I said, why are they here to learn Quechua? And I said, he said, if you're going to do business outside of the built-up areas of Peru, out in the rural areas, Quechua is your way in. And I was blown away.
Right.
So if we believe that the Chinese and the Russians, who I've interfaced with their attachés and in all the countries that I worked in Latin America, if we believe that they're not interested in being in our hemisphere, then we're fooling ourselves, because they are certainly interested. I believe last week we had the Board of Visitors for WINSEC, which is it's a board that Congress set up to come down and review our curriculum every year to make sure we're doing the right thing. And I mentioned to them when we were, and during my opening remarks, that we're in a competition of ideas in Latin America. And I think that our values, our instructors, and our instruction really are what are going to help us win that competition.
Excellent. I'd like to follow up on that by looking at maybe the influence of Iran in the region, because Venezuela has given an island to Hezbollah. We also know that ISIS has some activity in the Caribbean. How are we confronting terrorism and the growth of terrorist cells throughout Latin America?
Yeah, we talked about this earlier a little bit. What is old is made new again. The Israeli embassy bombing in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, it's not recent. So these organizations have been in Latin America for a while. I don't know if you knew, there's an Iranian television station in La Paz.
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many people speak Farsi in La Paz, but I thought it was, when I was there, I thought it was kind of unique. But yeah, back again to our competitors wanting to be in the region. And when I say competitors, I don't just mean obviously the governments. The competition for ideas includes terrorist organizations, and it includes cartels, and they are operating not freely in most countries, but in some countries very freely. I think that the Southcom commander mentioned the degree to which funding in Venezuela had shifted from the oil industry to a cartel-based funding source, and I thought, wow, that's incredible. So yeah, these organizations are alive and well. They're not our friends, and they are operating within our sphere of influence, and they're operating within the countries of our friends. And I think our best way to get at that is not to tell them what to do, is to help them professionalize, build their toolbox to get at their own problems and support them as needed.
Excellent, yeah.
Colonel Suggs, Bolivia's in the news a lot very recently. Could you explain a little bit as to what's going on for our audience, so that we could understand a little bit about what the situation is?
Yeah. So, by the way, I love Bolivia. Me and my family lived in La Paz for 3 years. The airport is over 10,000 feet, so you should, if you were in an airplane, you'd be using oxygen. But no, it was great. I love the Bolivian people. And Evo Morales was elected to office with a lot of hope from the Bolivian people. What they thought was, he's a populist, obviously, and what they thought was, this is a guy who's there for me. And you know, even there were a lot of us Americans who thought, hey, this could be good. You know, he was the president of the Cocoa Growers Union, so that's never something that really helps. And then he overstayed his time in office, and then when that ran out, he had the Constitution changed so he could stay in office even longer. So at some point, he shifted from being democratically elected to being someone who to a dictator. He maintained power through the military and police forces. Now, recently, here this week, right? After protests, the commander of the Bolivian armed forces said that he could no longer, or he would not, put down the protests because he was not going to face his own people in the streets. And I think that that was a brave thing on his part. That was a brave thing on his part. And he was submitting himself to the will of the people. Well, I have to believe that maybe we had something to do with it. He's a 2003 or 2004 graduate of WINSEC. And it's my hope that that in his time with us, that our focus on the democratic values and human rights helped form his decision to side with the people, and in what he believes and what many believe was an illegitimate election for Evo, who many say stole the election. At some point, that's a policy position for the Bolivian people. I don't want to get involved with that. But any time that we see a military person who has chosen the right chosen the way of not harming innocents, then we have to believe that we did something right.
Yeah, I have a question. So changing a little bit, looking at, in a sense, a crisis of democracy. We see a growth of organized crime, a growth of gangs, and that signifies, to a certain extent, the loss of government's control over poor suburbs in particular.
Yeah.
Does that indicate a crisis of democracy or some kind of crisis of governance within Latin America?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the most obvious example that the people at home would probably recognize would be what's happening in Central America. Yeah. And I think that that's easy to point out because what's happening in Central America is leading directly to what we were calling caravans coming north and coming through Mexico and the border issue. So let's get right at that. So we can't pretend that that the problems that are occurring because something happened yesterday that's driving the problem today. So if we look at what's been occurring, we've seen a decade of drought in the area of the growing region in Central America. Well, what happens? Farms close down, people move to a different crop that can sustain drought. By the way, coca is a crop that can sustain drought. They move to a higher elevation and start growing coca. And the people who were farming have no job. So they migrate to the city. The cities become overflowed. The safety net that existed in those countries is no longer sufficient to take care for the people who have no job. So you start to see the crumbling of the institutions of government. So I don't believe it's necessarily a crumbling of their democratic values, but the government doesn't have sufficient resources to take care of the people who need the safety net to be in place. And that's frankly what happened. And who moves in? The cartels move in, the gangs move in, and if you're willing to traffic in illicit crops, then there's still a business in Central America. So I don't think it's a crisis of democracy. I think that the social institutions in those countries, they need bolstering and they need a little bit of support.
Good. General Michael Hayden once said that currently we're seeing a jockeying for positioning for the post-liberal order. Either the liberal order will survive Liberalism will survive, or something will replace it. But right now we're seeing a fighting for that.
Yep.
How do you see that playing out in Latin America? And do you find that difficult when you're teaching your students? Do you find any difficulty in explaining the liberal values and the liberal order?
No, I don't think so. I think that that I would, that's a great question, because I think, and as you were saying that, I was thinking of the examples we could use, and isn't it neat? The Chinese have created a hybrid model. Mm-hmm. They've created a hybrid model, and so they are a capital communist, right? And they see that as an alternative to either communism or capitalism, which I think is a false narrative. Capitalism is a way of running the economic side of our society, but it has nothing to do. It does a little bit, but it's separated from the ideological belief in democratic values that we have. So, yeah, I don't have a problem really explaining that to them. I think they really understand it very well, maybe better than we do. My deputy commandant is one of them is a policeman in Panama, and his discussion with me about how they saw the Chinese come and their influence in the Panama Canal. They have a contract there now. The Chinese don't just come and work and hire people from the area. They bring their own materials from China. They bring their own people to work from China. And so you've outsourced the entire canal. Mm-hmm. And nobody in the country gets jobs. There's no tax revenue off of it because that's part of the deal. So I think that, and there have been arguments about the neo-colonialism that China is doing now in Latin America. And I think that they see that better than we do because it's occurring right in front of their faces. Mm-hmm. Whereas for us, it's a distant thing. When we talk about China, that's where my iPhone was made and maybe my sneakers were made there. We don't see it as upright in front of your face as they see it. Mm-hmm. I would actually argue that they are more worried about it than most Americans are.
Interesting.
Yeah. At a recent WINSEC graduation, I had the privilege of seeing a speaker from Chile talk about a natural disaster where he came in, administered relief, established order, and took charge for a region for a certain period of time and then stepped back so the democratic governments could in fact survive. He attributed this action to his education at WINSEC. Do you have any other success stories from people who have graduated from WINSEC, have gone on to Latin America and have done similar things?
No, but remind me to send that guy a thank you note. Right? No, actually, we just talked about it. So the commander of the Bolivian Armed Forces, who, rightfully in my mind, refused to put down his own people as they were protesting the election results. The fact that he is a WINSEC grad makes me proud.
But what about what countries are at WINSEC? I mean, that would be a good place to turn to next. We are part of Latin America. We're preserving democracy. Who's a part of it? Which countries send students?
Oh, that's great. So obviously Colombia is very involved. There are a lot of Colombians there, and we're blessed. We have moved from just the military to also having police. So we have Colombian military police, and when I say military, I mean Air Force, Navy, Army, the whole thing. The Brazilians are very involved. My military deputy commandant, Colonel William Kamei, is a Brazilian. He's a great officer, and we're very proud to have him. The Peruvians are there in great number. We do have Chileans mostly send. We don't have very many Chilean instructors, but they send their cadets, which is unique. So that's. Do you mind if I touch on that for a second? No,
please, absolutely.
So and maybe when I was talking last week to the Board of Visitors, I don't think that they understood how important it is to have the cadets. So if you in every country, there's a version of their West Point, right?
Right.
So, and when you graduate of college, you're ranked number 1 to, like me, number 782, right? But in those countries, what we find historically is the guys who are in the top 5, they track for their whole career, and one of them ends up being the commander of that force.
Wow.
Well, this year, for example, from Peru, the Army, Navy, and Air Force have all sent us the top 15.
Wow.
So in a generation, I believe that the commander of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in Peru will all be WINSEC grads.
Wow.
And that was the takeaway that I wanted the congressman who was at our Board of Visitors meeting last week to understand. When you talk about an investment, a U.S. taxpayer investment in the future of our hemisphere, I mean, that's an incredible investment, and it will pay great dividends for the future.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we have a long-standing history here at Troy University with WINSEC, and recently signed another
Yep.
MOU.
Yep.
And we were very thankful that one of your students, Adelton Diaz,
Yep.
spoke at a recent conference that we organized, a NATO conference. Could you talk about the importance of this partnership between the military and civilian institutions moving forward?
You know what? That's a great point. I think I mentioned this at the NATO conference. So, if we believe in Clausewitz, for example, he said that war is diplomacy by other means. So, we really are subordinate. The military, it's just a tool in the toolbox towards getting at our end state, right? Our desired ends, and that is under civilian control of the government. So the military, great as it is really just a tool of the state, right? The civil state. And the ideas that are built, that the state is built on, they come from the people, from academia. And so the ideas how to figure out where we're going to go come from academia. They come from people going to college, writing papers. That's where they come from. And so if we're going to have those ideas inculcated and spread throughout Latin America, then the relationship between academia and the military has to be stronger. It has to be much stronger, And so my heroes are not in the military. I mean, I would say there's some very great men and women who've served in our military. My heroes, one of my heroes was my third grade teacher. I think that the future of our country really is in the schools and in classrooms. And if we don't do a better job of focusing on them, and then the military is not going to matter. If the moral fabric of our country starts to fall apart because of a lack of beliefs in our democratic and values, then we're lost. And it doesn't matter how powerful a military we have. And back to your question, I think that is something that we share with our military members from around the world in the hemisphere, and that they share back in their hometowns.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah, Colonel Suggs, it has been a great pleasure, and I thank you so much for your participation in this program.
No, the pleasure's mine. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.